very excited tonight to have Wasafiri's editor, Malachi McIntosh, who will be moderating this session and kicking off our Poetics of Home event today. And so I think Malachi needs a very few introduction. He's such a well-known editor for the contemporary literary magazine Wasafiri, and he has previously also co-led the Runnymede Trust Our Migration Story project, and spent 4 years lecturing in postcolonial literature at Cambridge. He's also the author of Emigration and Caribbean Literature and the editor of Beyond Calypso, rereading Samuel Sappho. So, and he has worked on fiction and non-fiction as well, very widely. I won't go through the whole list of his accolades because there's very many. And he is a very brilliant editor, scholar, and writer. And he tweets as well sometimes. And so, welcome to link up to him. And so I think without further ado, I really kind of welcome everyone to come over and hand over the whole session to Malachi.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you for everyone joining us this evening, if it is the evening where you are. As Jenny said, my name is Malika McIntosh. I'm the editor and publishing director of Wasafiri, the magazine of international contemporary writing. And it is both a very deep honor and what feels like a very big responsibility to chair this inaugural session of the Poetics of Home Festival. The festival is the brainchild of our MC for this evening, Jennifer Wong, who just introduced me. And if you've not seen the full program yet, it is a range, a kaleidoscope, a myriad of sessions, 12 events over the next 2 weeks, uniting writers from the full breadth of the Chinese diaspora to discuss, among other things in themed sessions, writing from Hong Kong, experimental poetics, breaking down stereotypes, writing desire, and more and more and more and more and more. It's a fantastically varied program. And if this is your first event, do check out the full series to see what else you may be interested in attending. I'm sure there will be much more. So today I'm joined by 3 esteemed poets who, in their markedly different styles, engage with questions of migration, family, location, diaspora, and belonging. And our event as a whole sits underneath a frame, underneath a question, which is, having lived through experiences so different from their parents, how do poets Sarah Howe, Wai Keung, and Fiona Sze-Lorrain learn to claim their sense of place? Now, for those of you who don't know the biographies of the 3 poets here today, and I suspect you do, which is why you're here with us, Sarah is a poet, academic, and editor. Her first book, A Leap with Jades, won the T.S. Eliot Prize and the Sunday Times PFD Young Writer of the Year Award. She studied for a BA, MPhil, and PhD at Christ College, Cambridge, and spent a year as a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard. Sean is based in Glasgow. His pamphlet, You Are Mistaken, won the Rialto Open Pamphlet Competition 2016. And his first full-length poetry collection, which he told me how to pronounce earlier, and I've already lost it, Sifan Glashko, will be published by Verge. It has been published by Verge Poetry Trust this year in April. And Fiona writes and translates in English, French, and Chinese. She's the author of 4 poetry collections, Water the Moon, My Funeral Gondola, The Ruined Elegance, and Rain in Plural. And she's translated more than 12 volumes of contemporary Chinese language, French, and American poetry. So, as I said, a very esteemed group of writers with us today. I think the very best introduction to these 3 and the best way of sort of carrying us into this discussion about diaspora and belonging and claiming place and space is through their own work. So I invited Sean, Fiona, and Sarah to offer short readings to issue us in to a discussion, which then will be followed by a few more readings, and then will be opened up to questions. So just so you know what's in store, we'll be reading, then chatting, then we'll have hopefully about a half an hour for audience questions. So as we speak, as the poets read, do generate some questions in the back of your heads. It kind of seems unnecessary these days since we're all so familiar to talking to each other online. But just for housekeeping, do please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking. If you'd like to speak, use the hand raise function, please. And in question and answer, don't be afraid. You don't have to speak a question. You can use the chat and we'll pick up questions in that way. So hopefully that all sounds good to everybody. Hopefully everyone is as excited as I am to hear from these three, both reading their work and talking about their work. So without further ado, we'll kick off with Sean opening us up with some reading. So over to you, Sean.
Thank you so much, Malika. I'm just going to share my screen here so hopefully everyone else can see the poem. So the first one I'm going to do is a poem that's about my grandfather, my Gungung, as I called him. My maternal grandparents, they were born and raised in Hong Kong, and they survived the war there and then came over to the UK in the 50s, and where they opened takeaways effectively. Moved around the UK, opened up takeaways, and a lot of my work is very much inspired by their life. I feel this sort of obligation to, in some way, attempt to present them or encapsulate them in some small way, even though I know that that's impossible. And one thing about my grandfather, my Gungung, was that he was probably the only person in my family who really had any kind of creative streak within him. He used to make his own notebooks, he used to draw a lot, he used to, sort of write small things. And after he passed away a few years ago, or more than a few years ago now, about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to be the grandchild to receive the collection of his drawings, and these drawings were done on the back of receipts, and a lot of them were of the same tree, or at least a very similar looking tree. And so this poem is about thinking about where that tree could be. And this poem is therefore called Where is the Tree My Gungung Drew? After he died, I received a collection of his drawings, and there it was, the tree. He had doodled it at some point, probably sitting idly in his chair watching the weather or EastEnders or listening to his cassette tapes of Cantonese opera. The tree. Perhaps it was inspired by something he was watching or listening to at the time. Perhaps it was a news report which showed a park or the countryside. Or maybe something happened in EastEnders in the park of the middle of the square there. The tree. Or maybe it was based on a tree he could see outside from his chair, one of the overgrowing things from the neighbor's place, or a tree which used to be there years ago, before the Asda got built in its place. Or it could have been from an advert on the side of the number 40 or number 40A at some point when one of them drove by. The tree. Was it from a memory he held dear, from his childhood in the Hong Kong countryside before the war split that image apart forever? Or from his first step onto mainland British soil? There must be some trees somewhere in Liverpool or Manchester or Bradford or Leeds or York or Hartlepool or Grimsby or somewhere he had lived. Maybe there'd been a park that had held some special meaning to him, near to the first house he bought, or the first business he opened, or his wedding, or outside a hospital or takeaway as he held one of his children for the first time, or even one of his grandchildren. The tree. Or could it have been a representation of the tree by the burial plot he had acquired? The one on the slight slope facing eastwards, at the bend of the small foresty path, at the south end of the cemetery, the same place where I stood that day when I said goodbye, then received his drawings. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean. Fiona?
Yes, hi. My poem has no autobiography I mean, no autobiographical trace or indication. But I thought it was something that always reminds me of Asia. So here it is. I wait for the ruined elegance. Plum blossoms comb the southern mountain. Maybe winter, maybe spring. What can the difference give a bystander? If only swallows mend the wind. Another way to choose. Tree to tree. Grievance by grievance. I watch the sun turn from a sphere to a palace. Burning, but not disastrous. Soon or now, my gaze will break. I want to honor the invisible. I will use the fog to see white peaches.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fiona. And Sarah?
I'm also going to share my screen. I'm going to read a couple of short sections from a much longer poem, which I wrote as a commission, a sort of oral history piece, knitted from the testimonies of passers-by in London's Chinatown. So there are sort of different speakers and different perspectives on events, but these are a couple of different characters from the poem. And I suppose this might be clear that they're knitted from, in large part, the actual words of people who offered their memories for the project. So this is a compulsive gambler. Sorry, I'm not a skillful enough actor to do anything like the accent. I used to gambling a lot along Gerrard Street. I am compulsive gambler the past 40 years. Lots of illegal den have all closed down. Now it's the machine that really hook on me. We called it the crack. You addicted. I can gamble from 10 in the morning until it close. My missus found out. She told me, I want my life back. Luckily, I'm a loner. I gambled once until I had only £1 in my pocket. I had to give her life back. You don't feel pain. You don't feel hurt. You hear the voice saying, you could win tomorrow. Too much temptation here in this street. It's a very lonely life. I see people commit suicide. I heard about that. People say to me, you still got 2 boys to look after you. People say to me, your luck is bad, but only bad in gambling. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong way. Okay, and this is spoken by the BBC's. I suppose it's sort of knitting together of a few different testimonies. We're the BBC's, not Paxman on the news, but British-born Chinese. We don't speak our parents' language well or at all. Maybe that shows how British we are. It doesn't stop them shouting ching chong from a passing car. We get by. Food goes a long way. We might be mute, but we can eat Chinese. To the community, we're bananas, yellow on the outside, but white where it counts. Over here, you can pick between nerdy Asian or Kung Fu fighter. Isn't it weird how they contradict each other? We used to joke, you're not an Asian, you didn't get an A. Maybe it's up to the younger ones to push. We have a voice. Still, the older generation had their ways. In the olden days, when drunk 3 a.m. punters would roll into their takeaway, all slitty eyes and punches, our grandparents some nights dished up a tray of crispy chili cardboard. the lack of beef, their silent means of getting back for all the years of grief.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you again, Sean, Fiona. I think wonderful ways into the focal point of our conversation, which is around, I suppose, touches on the core issue of this entire festival, about living in diaspora. And I think one of the central features of that experience is this gap between an individual's experience, individual's upbringing, and that of their parents, that of their grandparents. And across all of your work, although I think, Fiona, in your writing, it tends to be more elliptical, less directly addressed, there are these questions about difference. Your BBC's poem picks up on it really well. Sarah, Sean, the way you introduced your writing about your grandfather, saying, that you were inspired to write by him, and you felt an obligation to encapsulate their lives. All of your works are to an extent actively engaging with questions of being and belonging. And I think my first question is, quite often when we speak of writers, we say that there's a particular event that led to their emergence as writers, almost like superheroes. Something happened and then suddenly they emerged from the records of writers. And I think in the case of writers in diaspora, across multiple diasporas, my specialism being the Caribbean, that experience of being separated from or feeling different from or removed from is almost the inciting incident in the writer's life, the thing that leads to the writing. And I'm curious, with the three of you, how far your lives currently in or of diaspora have led to, inspired your work and affect the way that you approach your writing. And anyone can kick off.
So for me, I very much had that moment. I've always really enjoyed writing and trying to write poetry, but I had no real interest in writing directly or consciously, indirectly about my heritage or identity or anything like that. And then it was when my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, and we had, as per his wishes, it was quite a sort of traditional Hakka Chinese funeral, but it was in the setting of West Yorkshire. It was in a Church of England church. And there was all this sort of information that was coming at me about how to do things that I wasn't aware of and that I didn't know. And I was told, oh, we don't know why we do this. It's just his wishes. It's just how we do things. And then hearing stories from other family members and other people about his life that I had no idea about, because he never liked to talk about his life. And it just sort of made me want to try and explore ways of encapsulating some of his experiences, and therefore my own as well, through my own perceptions of him. And just through that, it sort of really occurred to me how little of the stories of that generation of migrants from Hong Kong was really captured in any kind of way. So that was sort of a real jumping off point for myself, trying to write about my own perceptions of that generation and the sort of connections and disconnections between myself and that generation.
I think you put it in a really beautiful way, Malachi, the idea that that some sort of dislocation heightens one's attention to the world in a funny way. That was definitely my experience. I was 7 when my family moved from Hong Kong. And although this is sort of not my direct origin story that I would usually tell myself about how I became a poet, I think in a way it was. One of my first, my first recollection of English poetry, which I don't think I'd met before that, was age 7 being asked to memorize Robert Browning's Home Thoughts from Abroad by my primary school teacher. And those of you who know that poem, maybe you were made to memorize it too. It's the one that goes, "Oh, to be in England now that spring is there." And the last couple of lines, which I'm going to mangle because I'm obviously not very good at memorizing poems, it goes something like, the buttercup, the little children's dower, so much brighter than the gaudy melon flower, or something like that. So I dutifully memorized this poem, but I think I also spent quite a lot of time, even as a 7-year-old that week, and then in the years subsequently, sort of trying to puzzle over what that teacher had meant by that exercise and what message she was trying to give me. And the fact that to me, the gaudy, exotic, tropical fauna, the banyans and the banana flowers were at that point the familiar thing, and the buttercup in its restrained English beauty, the strange and unfamiliar thing. I mean, I remember running up to a lawn in our first fortnight in England and picking up a dandelion clock and blowing it in innocence across this sort of open front lawn that must have belonged to a neighbour, and being shouted at by the English lady whose house it was because of spreading these weed seeds. And I was just so amazed by this flower that they're such a cliche in poems now, aren't they? Dandelion clocks, but I'd never seen it. And yeah, so that's a sort of allegory of how I think I became a poet, seeing this whole set of flora I'd never met before, buttercups or melon flowers.
I think the term diaspora, as a Chinese diaspora poet, has always sort of puzzled me. I could never exactly figure it out, what it means, really. I think it's sort of more of an identity, and I've always tried, to step away from any identity politics, although ironically at the moment that's all what it seems to be. So in that sense, I'm not very fashionable, I'm afraid. I think writing poetry is, to me, a sense of being closer to home, whatever home means. And my definition of home is fairly simple. It's just love, wherever you feel loved and wherever you give love, and that's home. It depends on the periods in my life. Sometimes I do have some affinities with places. Other times I have affinities with, to and with people. So I'm fairly happy with that switch and with that transparency. On that note, I do have to, I'm afraid I do have to confess that my first poem, I don't mean the first poem I wrote, but the first poem I've ever, I learned and I could still remember, was and is a Chinese poem. And it was a poem that my mother made me memorize, and at the age of 4, looking at the moon, because she was trying to sort of like persuade me to take part in some sort of I don't know, some sort of competition or whatever. And of course I didn't, but the experience gave me a sense of music, the words and the plays and whatnot. So I can't help from time to time think of poetry as some sort of a tradition, whether it's a British tradition, whether it's an American tradition or a Chinese tradition, simply because my first poem was such a traditional poem, it was just a poem from Tang Dynasty. So that stayed with me. I'm not certain if that answered your question. That in itself is very sophisticated.
No, I think it opens up a lot of potential avenues for exploration. I think that word that you summoned, tradition, is really interestingly interwoven through all of your responses. So Sean, you say you came to poetry primarily through the result of the collision with tradition. So a tradition that perhaps you felt you ought to be able to earn, but you didn't. And therefore you developed a poetic practice as a means of getting closer to it, understanding it, negotiating your position in relation to it. Sarah, at some level, I think your answer was about another kind of collision with tradition, this English tradition that was, tradition in this classical sense of a canon, which was thrust upon you. And that experience was slightly alienating. And I think that term alienation is another, I think, that naturally emerges in the context of diaspora. So how far you as individuals use your work as a means of overcoming alienation. And it seems to an extent that you're all saying that you do, and Fiona, in fact, and you saying that you try to escape identity politics through your work, at some level is sounds like a response to being alienated from an identity that's thrust upon you.
But it's funny you say that, because you asked the question of how do you overcome your image. The reality is that most people don't want to overcome some sort of image. Even beyond that, they even want to recreate an image of themselves and then project that, you see? So it has to do with the advertisement, the advertising, the advertisement. Well, I'll just leave it at that because I'm interested in what my colleagues have to say about it. Because the reality is that, you can't overcome your image to some extent. Either you honor it, and then after that you see what you can do with it, and just be with it. Or, even better to just go with the reality rather than the image itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was told once at a poetry festival that I should write more about my identity because otherwise, I need to in some way seize it for myself, because otherwise people will just assume it for me. And that always stayed with me in both positive and negative ways. And I really like what Fiona, you said there about poetry being this way of returning to home. And I think for me that really resonated, because maybe it's less about sort of escaping from alienation and more as a way of returning to this idea of a home, this idea of a place that in some way makes sense, or in some way comforts me, or in some way enriches me. And, it's less about wanting to escape than it is just sort of being able to have this safe environment where I can explore the things I want to explore, be they identity-based or non-identity-based. I think it's. I mean, I write a lot about food, so maybe it's just because food's always on my brain. But poetry always reminds me of a lot of food, because they're both sort of ways of connecting to different parts of the world, different parts of your identity, different parts of the city you're in. Whatever it is, they can all be used as this way of reaching out, but also of sort of fulfilling yourself and your own needs, your own desires, your own wants, without necessarily, sort of basically just fulfilling something within you that wants to be feeling more at ease or more at home. So I think that's that word home is really, I really like that.
I have to say that I regretted when I used the word home. Once I used the word home, I'm like, oh dear, it's going to open up this Pandora box. And I want to say that when I used the word home, I was thinking of a center too, in that sense. So maybe a center will be more interesting if we don't want to take the route of a home and geography and displacement and stuff like that, even though we're supposed to be talking about home.
Sarah?
Yeah, no, I think home without is definitely like not a physical place.
Sarah, I wonder if you had any thoughts
on alienation. I guess to echo what's already been said, I feel like I spent my first book trying to work through various insecurities I'd had from early childhood, in a way. And one of which, I found it very moving, Sean, the way that you talked about your writing towards your grandfather. In that book, I was writing towards my mother. And it's really strange looking back at that book, sort of 5 years on now, including, well, changed by the experience of having gone back to live with my parents with a small newborn baby for 2 years quite recently, and sort of almost re-meeting my mother again and revisiting my childhood. And I suppose being struck afresh by quite how damaged a person she has been by her life and her early experiences. So I guess I was writing poems for years as a way to try to connect with her and to try to understand the gulf in the experiences that she's lived and I've lived. I think that was a driver for me for a long time. Not anymore, I think, but for a long time it was.
So the idea of kind of almost using the word to reconcile something in whatever way. And then Sean, as you said, to kind of construct a home. And one thing I really wanted to talk about in relation to all of your work is the role of language. And in various different ways, and I think you have three very, very different poets, actually, who are all coming at a variety of questions, some overlapping from different angles, but all of you, in your own ways, write poetry that is directly interested in language, the textures of language, different languages brought together on a page, you know, the contrast between the written alphabets of, or the written languages of Chinese and English, etc. I'm just curious how that construction of home or belonging or space or reconciliation, whatever terms you want to use, how for you in your individual practice, language plays what seems to me as a reader, not yourself as a writer, language seems to have a really central role in your sort of individual project.
So if we go back to, I hate starting answers like this, but if we go back to my childhood, I think that was what really, language was the thing that brought me a lot into wanting to write poetry. I remember having a cassette tape of Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas and not really understanding it because the language was so foreign to me, but just really enjoying the rhythms of it. And similarly, I was always very fascinated by people in my family who maybe would speak broken English or speak English not very well, and the ways that conversations would form between people for whom English wasn't their first language. I always liked the interesting phrases that came out of that, and I thought that was often, you know, a lot better than actual English. And similarly, moving around quite a lot, growing up, living in different parts of the UK and being exposed to different accents really influenced me as well. I just thought it was really interesting how different people spoke, and the way that spoken language could be so disconnected from written language. It could be the same word but pronounced so many different ways by so many different people, which, you know, in a way is similar to Chinese language and how, you know, the differences between that written and spoken as well. And so, yeah, I think language is very much sort of central to my interest in poetry in that way. And yeah, sort of, especially in terms of the vocalization of words and how they're written.
Fiona?
My answer to your question about how languages come together, the real answer is I don't know, and I don't want to know. I mean, I live in France. I'm a French. I speak French. Most of the time I speak French. I have very, very little daily experience speaking English. I work in Chinese. Obviously, my mom scolds me in Chinese, but you know, which is why we don't go that way. So it's fairly, how should I say, like a melting pot. You know, I just give up trying to figure out how that happens and what the recipe is or whatnot, and I deliberately do everything I can not to intellectualize on it, because there's a certain mystery into it, a certain excitement, I would say. It's always something that I can't control, and I think that's much more, much less academic. And obviously it's not always fun, you know, because I sometimes do end up feeling as if I'm not speaking English, I'm not writing in French, and absolutely not at all controlling Chinese. But you know, in between something happens, you see, and perhaps that's my way of creating poetry. And I'm not a fast writer in poetry. Poems come very painfully almost to me, which is why when something happens, you know, it's as if it's something that I can't let go, even if it's a bad poem, although I'm not supposed to say that. I would just, you know, take it and treasure it like a good poem. That's really because of the struggle, I suppose, between languages. And I'm surprised to hear that people don't struggle between languages. I consider myself rather fluent, actually, in, you know, in a certain level of fluency in all these three languages, and I still struggle. So, you know, when people do not struggle with the languages, that's like, they must be Einstein, and even Einstein struggles. So you see, so the reality is, you know, struggling is no secret, and I think that's what is so real, that we might want to erase that unease a little bit, and try to say that, you know, well, that's struggling and that could be resolved. So yeah, unfortunately, that's also some form of an exile, I think. So,
Exile in the sense of being
a linguistic exile, I think.
Yeah, out of remove from the language, not in control of it.
Yeah, you don't really have a home language in that sense, you know, and after a while you don't even know what the source language and the target language is. So
I mean, I think uniquely of the poets of you three, you're positioned between three languages. In a way, perhaps Sean and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not necessarily, and I wonder if that contributes to an extent.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I feel my inability to speak Cantonese or understand it in any meaningful way as a sort of ache and a hole in my being. But I suppose it also meant that I had this strange experience. My goodness, I must have been such a lacking linguist that I managed to spend the first 7 years of my life in Hong Kong and not understand Cantonese. But it did mean I had this experience of, for much of those years, sort of experiencing language and spoken Cantonese as pure sound and pure affect, if you see what I mean, that I'd be decoding the conversations that my mum was having with her friends and people she was speaking to. And I would generally be able to follow the gist, even though I would only understand one word in, I don't know, 20 or 50 even. And she would always be astonished when I would know what she'd been talking about, because I was just listening to, you know, the texture of what she was saying and how she was emotionally reacting, and vice versa with her conversation partners. And I guess that sort of, I don't know what you would describe it as, a sort of experience of language as TV with mute on, did give me a kind of fascination, I suppose. I don't want to kind of essentialize it into Chinese is musical or anything like that, because I don't think that's what it was, but it did make me feel unmoored or ingenious in a funny way with my decoding.
Sean, I mean, I wonder how far that resonates with or diverges from your experience of sort of hearing and experiencing being in and with language.
So a lot of it made me think of when my grandmother died earlier this year, and the first thing that the way that my mum reacted was basically to say, "I'm going to lose my Hakka now," because she was the only one I ever spoke fully in Hakka to, and it's interesting because I still thought there was a question as well in the chat about how language and Chinese identity may connect, and I think it's it's so difficult because there's so many different Chinese identities and so many different Chinese languages, and so many different experiences throughout that. And I think for me personally, I don't know, I have very limited grasp of Hakka, but I've been learning other languages instead. You know, I've tried to teach myself Italian, and I've got an active interest in Scottish Gaelic, and they sometimes come up in my work as well. And I'm really interested in the way that different languages can interact with each other. But there is something about Chinese as a language, whichever form of Chinese it is, that feels in some way distant and yet close. It's like really close to me, and yet so it will always remain out of touch, because I'll never be able to have those conversations with my grandparents again, or, you know, with their ancestors. If somehow there's a time machine and I could meet them, how would we communicate, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's a question that I probably don't like to think about. I probably, as Fiona was sort of getting at, I try to just sort of go with it and go, you know, not let it affect me too much, because I fear that it will stop me from writing. But the more I'm writing, the more it's sort of coming up just organically in my work, and the more I sort of want to at some point try and encounter that on my own terms.
Thanks, Sean. Time is actually moving very quickly, but I think I have a question in my head which isn't perfectly framed, that's trying to respond to what you've all said. But what you just said about coming to things on your own terms, Sean, links to this kind of inchoate question I have, which is, I suppose, certainly in 2021, throughout history in Britain, I assume in France, as far as I know, in France and the US, certainly, there has always been the sense of China being this radically different place, right? And that has been grounded in a perception of the language as being, you know, very, very far removed from Roman scripts, for instance, the pronunciation being very different. Just this idea of, you know, China being this elsewhere, as it were. And of course, that's flared up in all sorts of horrible ways over the course of the pandemic. At some level, I think this festival is designed to very much complicate any ideas of singularity about China, Chinese heritage, Chinese diaspora. But I wonder, as individuals who are writing in a world, both a world in its, you know, most logical sense or a natural sense of the globe, but also in a publishing world where there are those ideas of radical difference, where there are particular expectations of, as we started in the beginning, performing identities or not. How you are, or maybe sometimes aren't, able to negotiate with those expectations and stereotypes, and how far your work is consciously responding to those things, or perhaps just, again, trying to forget about it, set it aside, and try an independent path. I think, Sarah, you haven't started yet, so it'd be nice to start with you.
Yeah, sure. I guess the way that I would probably answer that question is by talking about my hesitation and discomfiture I feel about the poems that I read at the start, and that project that I did, the sort of oral history thing. It was for a Radio 4 program called Conversations on a Bench. The conceit of the program is that a poet makes poems out of interviews that the BBC producer conducts with people sitting on a bench somewhere in the UK. The first thing I discovered on walking around London's Chinatown is that there is no bench in London's Chinatown. The only bench there is one belonging to a bubble tea shop that they've put outside themselves. So I politely requested of the owner that we have permission to record the program there. But anyway, I guess it was something different to what I'd ever attempted before. And I was made uncomfortable to some extent by the thought that me telling these stories and using this language, this, in many cases, this broken English, which is not how I speak English myself, might be sort of appropriative, though I think that concept needs unpacking more than this suggests. But that also I wasn't really sure what to do with the fact that there were characters we were speaking to who were, for example, a compulsive gambler, or the VBCs, or a legal immigrant working in a kitchen, you know, as well as lots of just passers-by who were there to buy their groceries. What does one do with these sort of stereotypes that come one's way? I found this quite difficult to negotiate. And yet I was very, very moved by the stories that people told, and sort of surprised by the revelations that came when people speak to a microphone. It was like many of them were sort of talking to the most difficult, most private moments in their lives. One woman was talking about her father's death, having just met us 5 minutes before. And so that for me was like an encounter with the Chinese diaspora in London in a way I'd, you know, never sort of consciously set out to have that encounter before. And I'm not sure if I will ever seek to publish these poems, but I sort of wanted to read them tonight to talk to this difficulty that I have, that I don't know how to be me, but also to speak in some meaningful way to British Chineseness.
So, just again, speaking out of the traditions that I know best, African-American writers, Paul Gilroy, Black British writers spoken about this, the idea of the burden of representation. So that, you know, you feel the weight of being one of the few voices, or being taken as a representative voice, or somehow being expected to carry a heritage, carry a population on your shoulder with your work, and that somehow kind of cramps your hand to an extent, or adds a level of discomfort or self-consciousness that maybe is a block on that easy flow of creativity. I don't know if I'm right. I'm encapsulating what you're saying quite right.
I think so. I think so.
So I think sort of this runs off of what Sarah was just saying, but for me it's too big. It's too much to think about representation in that way. It overwhelms me, and just sort of, you know, makes me want to curl up in a ball and shut the door. But what I do have is that sort of burden from my grandparents. I feel very much indebted to them and the lives that they've gone through, and my mum as well. And that sometimes pushes me to want to explore how I can tackle or connect with some sort of exploration of stereotypes within their lives, within their own experiences. And that's why a lot of what I write tends to suddenly come out in food. It comes out in especially the experiences of takeaway families and stereotypes that happen around takeaway food. And, you know, I was growing up, it was always very much two separate types of food. There was this food that we sold to people, and then there was this food that we ate, and they were very separate and difficult. And yet on the front of the takeaway, it would always say authentic Chinese cuisine or something. And so, you know, all these different things. So yeah, I think sort of picking my battles and wanting to just tackle one form of stereotyping, if possible, that's more than enough for me. I think any more than that, and I would sort of, yeah, as I say, curl up in a ball.
You asked about negotiating or performing some sort of identities. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the extent to which you feel any burden whatsoever. So from the literary world, from...
I'm not very good at negotiation, you know. I mean, I'm not a very diplomatic person, I realized, as I grow older. So that sort of like takes care of itself. I would say that it'll be much more interesting to explore self-knowledge rather than self-consciousness, you see. So if you take that route, they're much more protected. And it sort of resolves a lot of unnecessary conflicts. As for whether China is far or not, I mean, the best example I have, for me, is we are in a pandemic here, and consistently reminded that the virus came from Wuhan. So everywhere is nowhere, nowhere is somewhere, and somewhere is everywhere. So it's, I don't mean to sound Taoist, but it's a very circular thing. It's a cycle, and it's yeah. So
Thank you. I mean, these are complex questions, and I feel that I have a sense from the chat that we have audience members who are very, very keen to get involved in the discussion as well, speaking from their own experiences as much as talking to your experiences. So
it might, I think childhood memories and experiences, not to sound young or whatnot, but I do sometimes wonder if there might be a little overvalued, and vice versa. I always wonder if they're also undervalued, So I mean, I'm interested in what my colleagues think, because they're in my same boat, sort of. I mean, we're in the same boat, sort of, in a way, but not in the same boat at all. So sometimes I wonder whether it's the boat or the ocean that's the vessel that we're sharing. So anyhow, that's a question in the form of an answer to your question.
Sean, go ahead.
So one of the things this is making me thinking of is at my high school, at one point, there was another kid who enrolled there who was from, forgive me, somewhere in China, and the teachers attempted to make me his friend because they thought we would have something in common, and so they sat me next to him, and we had nothing in common at all. We just didn't, there was nothing between us at all in terms of like friendships or same interests or anything like that. And so, yeah, it's interesting, these things that connect us aren't necessarily the things that other people think that might connect us. And yeah, I think it's such a complex and oftentimes contradictory thing to think about, but there is, I think oftentimes within wider society, it's oversimplified, and we're told to oversimplify or encouraged to oversimplify it, when actually it's those complications that make it worth exploring.
Thank you, Sean. I feel like you've given, between the three of us, you've given everybody hours worth of material to discuss and think about. And as I said in the chat, everybody is seemingly chomping at the bit to ask you questions and to provide their thoughts and to speak about their own experiences. So I don't want to overstay my own welcome. And it feels like this is a good time to transition. So as I said at the beginning, we had structured the session to begin with readings and close with readings, and then open up to audience responses. And this feels like a natural time to sort of deepen the resonance of your words in the discussion through your work. So I believe we said that Sarah, you would read, then Sean, Sarah, then Fiona, then Sean to close this part, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Those can be deliver to your cameras and your microphones if you put up your hands, or if you prefer, popped in the chat. Again, do feel to percolate, reflect on what's been said so far. And I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
I'll share my screen again. Okay, here we are. I had thought of reading this, but I'm not totally sure. Not sure whether to read a poem that continues the conversation or that cuts. Maybe I'll read something that has nothing to do with Chineseness or identity, at least as far as I understand it. That's probably a useful thing to do as well, isn't it? Okay, so this is a new poem. Sometimes I think of the conkers I gathered once, when small myself, shucked of their green armour and placed in the glass bowl with the silvered rim to admire their mahogany sheen. Why am I driving the train off the rails? 2 nights ago, my son woke at 4 in the morning, crying for me in the dark. I placed my cool hand on his forehead, licked with winter clamminess. He said, I had a bad dream, softly, eyes tight shut, like something heard in a story. To my knowledge, his first, a concept I'd thought he hadn't yet met in his slender frame of human experience. The CD spinning leisurely in the neighbour's ruined magnolia glints its ambit of tapering sun. As I kissed his hair, I had a vision of his little head as a nut or hollow shell. A day or so later, the conkers issued a plague of white wriggling worms from their seemingly impermeable, glossy surfaces. Next morning over rice pops, I asked him what he had dreamed. I listened like a mother in a story, like listening could make it right. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Fiona?
So that's just one poem that we should read. Is that right?
Yes, that might be easiest, yeah. Thank you.
So I'm going to read a poem that has nothing to do with China, Asia, or whatnot, but there is something to do with that because it does touch about the sense of place, and it's about a musician. Give up thinking twice. That's part 1. Acoustic. Instead of Cohen, I heard another bard. Some thought him tender, some found him uphill. So what if rain must fall hard, one grumbled, cut inside each chord, but surrendered for time. Some thought him thunder, some found him uphill. I listened to each repetition, an apology in the fewest words. Cut inside each chord, but surrendered for time. I would have given up a mountain for the storm. I listened to each repetition, an apology in the fewest words. How long it could last, it might have sensed, when void of its heaven, it must fight its own earth. I would have given up a mountain for the storm. I credited the wind for his cri du cœur, discredited the same wind for his rhythm. How long it could last, it might have sensed, when void of its heaven, it must fight its own earth. How much delirium to be heard as a poem, he did not answer, did not bother. I credited the wind for his cri du cœur, discredited the same wind for his rhythm. To clarify music was not his task. How much delirium to be heard as a poem, he did not answer, did not bother. Some thought it ego, some said he pushed notes off the high-speed reel. To clarify music was not his task. I saw a door when he played harmonica. Some thought it ego, some said he pushed notes off the high-speed reel. Green, blue, and a jar. I saw a door when he played harmonica. No one waited behind or outside. Green, blue, and a jar. Time changed its size. The door, not his mouthpiece or unplugged version. No one waited behind or outside. I could ring the drums had it not turned his back on us. Times changed its size. The door, not his mouthpiece or unplugged version. The troubadour aged fast, not because of drugs. I could ring the drums had he not turned his back on us. I drew this theory from his Nobel Prize, how he took his time. The troubadour aged fast, not because of drugs. Heartbreak can be lean and acoustic, like a piece of meat if mood detained the beast. I drew this theory from his Nobel Prize, how he took his time. Every song, a friend and moon to compete for its chi and wives. Heartbreak can be lean and acoustic, like a piece of meat if mood detained the beast. Sick of the word love, it plagiarized the best failure. Every song, a friend and moon to compete for its chi and wives. And like a friend, it did not need to try hard. Sick of the word love, it plagiarized the best failure. And like a moon, it spoke through the graves and diaspora. And like a friend, it did not need to try hard. Some gave up despair to find his path. Some gave up even when alive. And like a moon, it spoke through the graves and diaspora. Years down the road, if words fell apart, this prophecy would ask for one odd star. Some gave up despair to find his path. Some gave up even when alive. None of his demons survived their trance. None of this passion leveled its height. Years down the road, if words fell apart, this prophecy would ask for one odd star. So what if rain must fall hard, one grumbled. None of his demons survived their trance. None of this passion leveled its height. Instead of Cohen, I heard another bard. So part 2, electric. Instead of Cohen, I heard another bard. Some thought him thunder, some found him uphill. So what if rain must fall hard, one grumbled. Cut inside each chord, but surrendered for time. I listened to each repetition, an apology in the fewest words. I would have given up a mountain for the storm. How long it could last, it might have sensed, when void of its heaven, it must fight its own earth. I credited the wind for his cri du coeur, discredited the same wind for his rhythm. How much delirium to be heard as a poem, he did not answer, did not bother. To clarify music was not his task. Some thought it ego, some said he pushed notes off the high-speed reel. I saw a door when he played harmonica, green, blue, and a jar. No one waited behind or outside. Times changed its size. The door, not his mouthpiece or unplugged version. I could ring the drums had it not turned his back on us. The troubadour ate fast, not because of drugs. I drew this theory from his Nobel Prize, how he took his time. Heartbreak can be lean and acoustic, like a piece of meat if mood detained the beast. Every song, a friend and moon to compete for its chi and wives. Sick of the word love, it plagiarized the best failure. And like a friend, it did not need to try hard. And like a moon, it spoke through the graves and diaspora. Some gave up despair to find his past. Some gave up even when alive. Years down the road, if words fell apart, this prophecy would ask for one odd star. None of his demons survived their trance. None of this passion leveled its height. Now the moon is almost hidden. The stars are beginning to hide. The fortune-telling lady has even taken all her things inside, or except for Cain and Abel and the hunchback of Notre Dame. Everyone is making love, or else expecting rain. And the Good Samaritan is dressing, is getting ready for the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Sean?
This poem's called Tombstone Day 2020 Glasgow, with thoughts of my Papua Gungun down in England. I tried to imagine once what it would be like, living over half your life without being fluent in the local language, how much more intelligent you would have to become at things such as social cues and body language, at reading expressions more times correctly than incorrectly. If you failed, then the consequences could be... All my life, I thought I had a slick imagination for that sort of thing. Even as a kid, I'd flick through the world atlas, looking up faraway places and think about what life may be like over there, what kind of food they might eat, what language they might speak, if there'd be anyone there who looked like me. Meanwhile, down the road at the front desk of the Spring Bamboo, they would sit together at the same time every day in a calm silence, thinking about inconsequential things, but doing so in Hakka. And there would be no need for words. Because she knew that he had already put the change in the till. And he knew that she had already flicked the switch on the fryers from the circle diagram to the one-line diagram. And they both knew that in a few minutes' time, they would unlock the front door together before flipping the plastic sign from the red side reading closed to the blue one reading open.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you again, Sarah and Fiona. Questions. So in the chat, there is a question, I think originally directed to you, Sarah, but I think would be a great one for all of you to answer while we get some more. Their hands up for questions in the chat. That question was, which language do you consider to be your first language?
Well, without question, English for me, because, well, though I suppose there's a paradox in Cantonese being one's mother's tongue, but not mother tongue, isn't there?
Well, I was born in Singapore, and there's a bilingual environment. So I do remember speaking Chinese first, but I also do remember speaking English at the same time.
Yeah, I was always encouraged to just speak in English. My family didn't really have any interest in me learning Hakka, which I wish I knew now.
I wonder if in that question, I sort of detected more of a philosophical underpinning in the sense of there's of course the language that we speak first, but the language perhaps we first recognize ourselves as belonging to or belonging with. Certainly in my experience, grandparents were Jamaican, they partly raised me, they spoke Jamaican patois. That is, which I can't speak, though I can understand it. That to me has always felt like my first language, even though it's not a language that I own, if that makes sense. And I wonder if any of you had had similar experience. Or not, as the case may be.
I suppose I had an experience more like what Sean's described, but I suppose Fiona, you might have more to say on this question. My mum would always say things like, no, you don't want to learn Cantonese, it's just slang, lots of swear words, not useful for business. You want to learn Mandarin to do business, like I was going to go off and be some big CEO or something.
I didn't have too much of that sort of a problem or conflicts because I wanted to learn everything. I was greedy, French was my third language, and if I could have a fourth, I would do it. But I can't because I'm limited in my capacities. I think what you were trying to push for is asking whether the first language has more ownership than the second or third or whatnot. As far as I'm concerned, when I have a second, a parallel, so to speak, activity, which is translation, and all I do is to create some sort of a democracy between the languages that I deal with. Some of the poems in French that I translate from French into English are not necessarily poems that I like, but they're poems that I love to have them in English. So it's much more complex than, because I like something and therefore I want it to exist in something else. And correspondingly, I don't find Chinese very attractive as a language in terms of its sound. I think it's very attractive when it's spoken beautifully, but not often these days in the main discourse, when people don't speak the language from their heart, they speak the language from the head, and then so all I hear is diction and rhetoric, and even when we speak when the Chinese speak Chinese, I thought sometimes I hear politics. So I'm not very popular in that arena, but that's my honest opinion, and I can be wrong, of course. And of course, English is a very common, well, I shouldn't say common, but a very practical currency. So we have less problem with that, just because it's practical. So.
I think sort of going off that, my interest in how words sound and the spoken word, as opposed to how it's written, has always made me very drawn to and fascinated by accents, dialects in English. And I think, it's sort of it's common to say that English is maybe sort of, a single language, but the more I sort of explore everything, the more you realize it's not really. There's so many different nuances within English that are sort of come up in different ways. For instance, I live in Glasgow, and yet, so just by talking, people can tell that I'm not born here. I get asked, like, whereabouts in England were you born, or something like that, just because the Glaswegian accent is so much its own thing, and that can be sort of replicated in so many different cities around the UK, the US, all English speaking parts. So I think there's a lot more nuance within English that I like to explore, as opposed to Chinese, where I have very limited understanding, and therefore it's less accessible to me in terms of exploring that nuance.
I think one of the things that's quite interesting about your collection, Sean, is exactly that, the multiplicity of English as it were, and also thinking about Scots Gaelic and interweaving that into the story of the everyday. And there's a kind of there's a kind of beautiful everydayness to the things that you write about, like stealing sauce from Nando's and reviews of restaurants, and you know what I mean. And in all of that is a range of Englishes, as it were, that are deployed for different reasons in different contexts. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, but a few I think have been directed towards individuals. And I wonder if there are any questions out there. Someone would like to raise their hand and speak on screen. If not, or a question in for the chat. Let's see. It's always very difficult to look at chat and speak and look at people's faces on the screen at the same time. I was wish I had an extra eye somewhere to focus on the chat, but that's a comment. Jenny, were you coming in with a question?
Yeah, but I wonder if anyone who drops the question, would they want to actually talk to the poet, or I've asked Wendy, like Wendy has a question just now, and Tina as well. Tina, would you like to talk, or?
I just kind of talked about language, and I just put in the chat there, like, when you mentioned about mother tongue. So when I was young, I spoke Hakka. So then I think my Hakka is just like identify with Sean. I speak Hakka like a 3-year-old. I probably understand it more than I can speak it, but I guess part of kind of connecting with that, and I'm thinking about my nieces and all that. They don't speak Hakka because they were brought up to speak Cantonese and English, and then there's that kind of tension about, oh, you know, the language, but there's that complete, you know, there's that whole tension of you've got to do well in speaking English, you've got to speak perfect English, and then it's like, oh no, but you can't lose your Chinese as well. So it's that constant kind of identity. And then growing up in Glasgow, you know, can we discover is like you were told like you can't speak that's slang, and then after the kind of, you know, the kind of sort of Scottish identity, then it's like, oh, I didn't realise that Scots was a language, you know, I'd put it down as slang, you know. And my husband was filling a census form and he got really annoyed because he realised he did speak another language, you know, but we've been brought up to think that's not a language, it's slang, you know, that kind of thing. So in a way, and I think language does fascinate me. My dad comes from a village in sort of Taipo in Hong Kong, the New Territories, and they actually have a dialect that's unique to that village. So it's kind of really strange. I think it's still going strong because my cousin, they have some sort of a association in Manchester. So it's weird. So it's almost like, I think somebody had mentioned, you know, whether dialects and language was back in sort of medieval times, or when, like, to keep outsiders out, you know, when you speak the language, that was like the way of knowing that you were an in-group or an out-group. So that kind of fascinates. But I always find, I don't know whether because, you know, sort of brought up speaking different languages, I always get influenced by people's accents. So if I'm kind of around somebody that has a really strong English accent or something, and then I might end up picking up that, or I'm very aware that my Scottish accent is really strong, and there's that kind of sense of feeling, right, I sound really. So I think there's definitely a hierarchy of language and dialects.
And the idea, again, this, which seems to be so common, and certainly my experiences, again, as a child, for what it's worth, being told not to speak something because it's not really a language, by the very people who speak that language, or that language is not useful for you, so don't learn it. Learn this one instead. It's going to get you where you need to go. Don't speak like us, speak like them, which is really fascinating when you think about it, and interesting that that's shared so broadly, again, across diaspora. There's a question in the chat from Wendy, which I think I might read out because it's directed at Sean, but I think it maybe applies, is one that everyone can answer. And we're actually getting very close to time, so this might be the last thing we can talk about. But it comes from your poem, Tinta Tapas, Sean. It has a line that says, Chinese food doesn't really exist as a thing in the same way that British food doesn't really exist. And Wendy wrote, it'd be interesting to hear you elaborate on that, since the discussion has covered the alienation and collision of identities and heritage. What about the merging and blurring of identities and heritages? That is, are there really such thing as differences in culture, as your poem suggests? Do you find, I think, these blurrings and merging, sorry, it's getting late. Do you find these actually liberating or adding to further confusion? So maybe Sean, and then if Sarah, Fiona Sze, Sarah, you have thoughts on that idea of boundary blurring. Is this good? Is it liberating? Is it bad?
So I think, yeah, the blurring of those lines is incredibly confusing, like really, really, really confusing. But it's within that confusion that the liberation then comes, because you are free from having to sort of fulfill other people's expectations of your heritage or your identity. I think one of the reasons why I sort of try and express this through food is because it's very obvious through food, and that, you know, there's certain food that people think is an authentic to a certain place, and other food that is actually eaten in that place. And it's the same with people, you know, there's all kinds of assumptions about an authenticity of a person, or a heritage or a culture, and at the end of the day, it's so much more nuanced than that, and everyone will have their own confusing and beautiful shadow that's sort of alongside them, and that they bring with them everywhere they go. And so, yeah, I think it is both confusing and liberating. Is my short answer to that.
Any further thoughts? Fiona?
Well, I'm not confused. I don't find boundary blurring confusing. I mean, I'm generally a fairly Cartesian person. I mean, that's the French part of me. So no, confusion is not part of my formula. I can be displeased at something else. I can be angry at something else. I can be, you know, I can have whatever negative adjectives you want me to put across. I can, but I'm not confused. That's one thing. I would say, I think someone asked a question, I think it's Eva, who asked whether I write poems always in English. The answer is yes, I always write in English, and I hope at some point I can write in something else, another sort of a vehicle. And so perhaps that would be the beginning of some sort of a boundary blurring, I don't know. I mean, translation is already quite disorienting sometimes. I think Hazel mentioned something about plagiarized the best failure and asked her where that come from. And I, very rudely, as I always am, told her that, you know, I had no idea. Well, that's the truth. But her very smart remark made me realize that, in fact, plagiarized the best failure could be some sort of a negotiation between languages, for my case, when it comes to, you know, the boundaries. And I think there's another question, am I right, about democracy between languages. So yeah, so that's a little bit of asking, you know, each other and one another to share something. Democracy is sharing, so it's sharing some sort of boundaries, and that's where conflicts always arise. I think that's quite a bit.
Yeah, I think those are all of them. Thank you. I think we need to wrap up because we're very close to time. We've got about 2 minutes left. I want to say a huge heart deeply felt thank you to the three of you for appearing, for sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much to everyone who attended. I hope you feel you've gotten a good insight both into the actual concrete poetry created by Sarah, Sean, and Fiona, but also them as individuals and thinkers. A big thank you to Jenny and the organizing team in the background for constellating the myriad events for this festival, of which this is just the very first. We have just scratched the surface. I think there's a list of what's coming, appearing in the chat. I think a beautiful thing about a long festival or longish festival on the same theme, it's possible to build and build and build on conversations that take place, that carry the insights from this discussion into the next panel and the next. See how others approach the same question, see how they complicate, resist, go along with, support, build upon ideas that were expressed here. So do definitely attend the rest of the program, which we hope is as stimulating as today. So a huge thank you to everybody. Thank you one more time to Jennifer Wong for pulling all of this together, this massive feat. And we very much hope you enjoyed it. Have a good night, if it's nighttime where you are, and take care.